Welcome to the Arizona Clinical Informatics video educational series on Cerner, lesson number 7, INET and intake and output. We'll deal with the INET portion first. INET is the preferred method of documenting on patients throughout their stay. It's a flowsheet format, contains cells, columns, and rows, much like a spreadsheet. It is a uniformed way to keep all nursing on the same basis of charting. It makes also for an easier data extracting for audits. Instead of just showing a demo of the documentation process, what I would like to do on this particular video series is just show you the special features that are within INET. If you understand these features in INET, it will make your documentation so much more easier and more efficient. When you open INET from the M page, you'll notice two columns of headers. One section is a view pane. And on that view pane, if you look to the right on this particular slide, you'll see an example of that. There are bands. Each band on INET expands to allow for more documentation. The names below the band name are called headers. So if you're looking at Med-Surg physical assessment to the right there, everything below that, starting with system review, sepsis screening, discharge readiness, and etc., is a header. If you highlight a header in blue, it will generate an open documentation section to the right. So here I've clicked underneath Med-Surg physical assessment the header called system review. And you'll notice over to the right that the system review pops up the header there in blue. You'll also notice in coordination with that, sepsis screening, HEENT adults with eye, ears, nose, and throat, opening as well in the view pane to the right. If you look over to the left under the Med-Surg physical assessment, you can follow the same headers as they run down the page. You could click on any header, say neurological, and it would advance you to the neurological view pane for documentation over on the right-hand side. For now, we see system review is highlighted blue on the left underneath the subheaders. And then we see system review on the right, also highlighted in blue. And you see a triangle that is pointing towards system review. And you also see a hollow triangle beneath that under sepsis screening, HEENT adults, etc. Those triangles indicate to you that there is more to document underneath those headers, such as system review, sepsis screening, HEENT adult. Each section in that flow sheet is truncated to allow for a quicker screen load time. If they were all expanded, it would significantly slow down the process of you being able to chart within the Cerner system. Selecting the hollowed out triangle icon will expand the contents of the headers and subheaders to show all of the documentation fields that are available. So on the image to the right, you can see that we selected system review. And when we selected system review and selected that hollowed out triangle, it expanded out to you see HEENT assessment, neurological assessment, cardiovascular assessment, and so on. There are times when you hit those hollowed out triangles that sometimes you have to click them once and then click them again in order for them to fully open up. Just be mindful of that. If we were to expand out our view on the M page of INET, we would see columns to the right of the headers. These are our documentation columns. The most current time is your first column. So in this instance, you see 5:19 with the column of 12:39 first, followed by the earlier column of 10 o'clock. Documentation can be performed through multiple methods, and you'll use these columns for the documentation purposes. One of the methods of documentation on the columns is through the single row documentation. This method allows you to click on only the row you want to place the information in. To do so, you would double click the single row box. In this instance, you see us under neurological, and we're double clicking under the time of 14:24 with the sub information of patient indicates. Once I double click, a box populates that allows me to select the response that best fits the patient's condition. In the third screenshot under neurological and patient indicates, you see the documentation that I would have selected showing up. it's called confusion, and you see it's in blue. It will remain in blue throughout the whole documentation process until I actually save it. This single row documentation, though, is not a recommended workflow for those of you that are completing a whole assessment. These are for the one-offs, the one little item that you need to document, or the 2 or 3 little items, but not a whole assessment. Another way of documenting is by entire subsections. For instance, at the right you see pupils, and I want to document the entire subsection devoted to pupils. To do so, you need to find a subsection you want to document on, and once you find it, you double-click on the subheader, shown in the first screenshot in the right with the red box. Once you double-click on the header, it will populate and activate the actual fields to be documented on below that subsection, as shown on the second screenshot. You would locate and continue each row of the subsection doing documentation until it's complete. You are allowed to skip over things that are not valid with the patient or non-applicable with the patient at the time. To advance to the next subsection, you have to press the Enter key after each response, and that will move you through the process. There is the notification that you are still in the blue documentation. Every time you see that, remember it is not saved yet. You have to sign off to change it from a blue color to a black color, and then it will be saved. For those of you that are going to be documenting by entire sections, you are able to do this with one area as well. What you would do is find the main header for the specific section. In this case, I'm selecting gastrointestinal. I can click the document and double click on the header, as you see there highlighted in red. Then select the responses that you want, pressing Enter after each, and it will work through all of the subheaders as you go down. A thing to note here is that this does take some time. You can hit the Enter key to bypass screens. You can also use your mouse and cursor to move to other parts of the screen while all of it is selected. There are just various methods to go through this documentation field when you have all the entire selections selected. You can even document through the entire band. What you would want to do is select the band you want. So instance here, looking at progressive care physical assessment, I would want to select that band. Once opened, I would double click on the time that you want to document and begin the documentation. So in this instance over to the right, I've selected the progressive care physical assessment band. I've moved over to the right where the documentation fields are. I've selected 1508, and this will activate all of that entire band under that time frame, and I can begin my documentation. So I begin selecting the responses, pressing Enter after each, or using my mouse and cursor, and I will work through all of the subheaders as I go down. If you notice on the right at the screenshots, you'll also see 2 time columns now. And it gives a reference to where I was telling you about unsaved worked in blue and saved worked in black. So the 1514 time frame you see as documenting currently, and you see it in blue. The 12 o'clock time frame there you see in black, that is a previous documentation. The good thing about INET is that you see others' documentation as you're going through, and that allows you to kind of compare of the status of this patient as you're doing the documentation, giving you that insight if something's actually occurring that is different from the previous assessment that was done. Obviously, in this lesson series, we can't cover each individual line of INET. So what we want to do is cover certain topics within the INET structure. We went through the overview of how to document through INET. Now let's look at some of the specifics. Let's look at system review first. System review covers all of the items within an assessment plan, primarily a general shift assessment. So we have HEENT assessment all the way down to integumentary assessment. Each one of these is a box where you can actually fill in, and it only lets you put in WDL for within daily limits or within defined limits. What you will see with this is, for instance, on the documentation that you see to the right, if it is within defined limits, you can document it here. And if it's not within defined limits, say, for instance, on the 1241 time column, neurological assessment, we did not document within defined limits, we would need to go down to the neurological assessment part of the chart and document the areas where the patient is out of that defined limits, those abnormalities, so we can show that we're actually doing our assessment with the patient. And the physician and other staff members are able to review those abnormalities that are outside those within defined limits or within daily limits within this patient. So you'll notice though that everything on the left-hand side is blue. The reason why the sections are blue underneath the system review is because there are reference texts involved with this. Remember, we're talking about within defined limits or within daily limits. So the blue part there, if you would highlight over HEENT assessment and hover that cursor over it, you would actually see reference text populate. This is telling us that there is going to be some definition within Cerner showing us the data that is the within daily limits or within defined limits. As a nurse documenting within defined limits or WDL on HEENT assessment or any of the other system reviews, you are essentially agreeing, for this instance where you're seeing the reference section that we pulled up, that the HEENT assessment on this adult is this: corrected visual acuity unchanged, no foreign body present in eyes, ears, or nose, no epistaxis, no abnormalities of mouth and throat. If that is not applicable to the patient, then you would leave the system review section blank and not put in a WDL within that. Let's now move to another section called dynamic groups. An ability within INET is a dynamic group function. The DG, as dynamic groups is called, this function will allow for labeling of the following: IVs, chest tubes, drains, tubes, wounds, surgical incisions, edema, and etc. So one aspect, if for example, we could look at wounds or surgical incisions. If I have multiple wounds or surgical incisions, it would be difficult in typical charting to identify which ones are which. So by using dynamic groups within Cerner, it allows us to identify all separate wounds, surgical incisions, drains, tubes, etc. And we could even name them wound 1, wound 2, etc. and etc. on there. Dynamic groups are found interspersed throughout the INET bands. Each band will have DG next to the name, such as shown here with peripheral IV DG. You will also see an icon that looks like a calendar or a grid box. Clicking on that box opens up the DG for documentation. Over the next few screenshots, we'll break down this process. Clicking on the box for peripheral IV DG, what we see now is a label that appears and documentation below that. What I would want to do is fill out all that applies. Here you see the instance of that peripheral IV site and also the peripheral IV size. As I'm selecting things such as the peripheral IV site of right arm and the peripheral IV size of 20 gauge, what I see over on the label is this starting to create the label. So under label, I now see right arm 20 gauge. When I am finished, I hit the OK button. Now the dynamic group is created with one label of right arm 20 gauge. And you see all the needed fields that can be documented on there. So I begin filling in the items that are appropriate to this patient on these fields. If you look down into the lower right-hand corner of the screen, that last screenshot shows you a completed documentation of the dynamic group for this peripheral IV of the right arm 20 gauge. You'll also notice this is where we put in our number of attempts to start the IV and the insert date and time. Once a dynamic group is created and began to be documented on, it can be assessed and documented on by any nurse or clinician who has the capabilities of documenting. Here we've continued our documentation on this peripheral arm IV, and we noticed here that we inserted a removal and a removal date and time. So how do we prevent somebody from going back and redocumenting on this with a new IV? Because obviously if this IV has been discontinued, we should have some way of discontinuing the dynamic group and starting a new dynamic group to show a different IV, and so we can keep track of that easier. Once discontinued, in order to prevent charting, right-click on the label and select Inactivate. What this will do is dither out the selections under that dynamic group, and this will allow for no more documentations to take place. To start a new IV and a new dynamic group, I would have to hit the calendar icon once more again to add a dynamic group and start the process all over again. There is something else that we could do. Say I inactivated the dynamic group by accident. I could right-click on that inactivated group one more time and select Activate, and it will allow me to document back in there. So if there was something I missed or I inactivated it by mistake, I can reverse the course on this and continue the documentation. Now we want to move on to annotations or notes that we can document in addition to the fields that we completed on our INET documentation. There are those times that you may not be able to select all that you need for the record, so you may have to utilize the annotation function in INET. Please note that though, annotations are not intended to be abused and for you to write all of your assessments in the notes. Why? Because meaningful use or promoting interoperability measures require reportable stats, and anything that is free texted documentation can fall out of the reports, requiring the auditor to dig further into the charts, which increases the chance of fallouts. On the time row needing the annotation, right-click and select the word Actions. You will receive options under Actions, and here we see Add Annotation and Flag Annotation. In this instance, I want to demonstrate the selection of Add Annotation. A pop-up box for annotations will appear. It has a title and a free text spot to put the documentation. So the title you would want to be just some small header, and then the rest of it would be the complete note documentation or annotation that you needed to place in. Here you see the example of the header entered and our annotation that we placed in there. In addition to that, you also notice that there's a flag to include an interdisciplinary summary. Be sure to click this flag button. Now I could have bypassed this having to click that button if I had chosen flag annotation over add annotation. Once you selected sign in the note, it will take you back to the INET screen, and you'll see the column of 937 where the annotation was placed in there. But you'll also notice, because we did select flag to include an interdisciplinary summary, we see a little flag that populates. Directly to the right, you can barely see it, but there's a small black caret or triangle that shows up in the upper right hand corner of that 937. That indicates that we have an annotation as well. If we had not selected flag to include an interdisciplinary summary, that particular caret or the black triangle would have been the only thing that would let us know that there was a note here. I can hover over either the flag or that black triangle, and I will see the annotation populate in a hover screen showing me what was documented on. You can also notice if you go to the results review on the M page under recent results, you can scroll down and find chart annotations and see the same annotation that we just did in INET. Let's now cover some more extended details regarding INET. INET is developed on what is called an 80-20 rule. An 80-20 rule means what you initially see in the INET flowsheet rows are what you would encounter to document on in 80% of the average patients that are admitted to the hospital. The remaining 20% of detail needs to be added manually. Manually adding these details saves the information added for the entire patient stay in the hospital and is patient specific, not nurse specific. For instance, you're in ICU and you have a patient that has an intra-aortic balloon pump or an IABP, and you'll need to go and find and search to get to that documentation details. In this example, IABP would be located under the oxygenation, ventilation, nursing band. But when you look at the screenshot to the right, you do not see the IABP information anywhere on there. This is because it falls into the 80-20 rule. To view and add the information, you have to access it through the extended details or customized view section. Once added, it will stay with the patient for the remainder of their stay. Let's go over the steps. With the oxygenation, ventilation, nursing tab open, look at the icons up at the top. Select the icon that looks like a calendar with a pencil eraser. This is the customized view icon. This will open up the customized view screen, which is the area where it allows us to add extra extended details to our charting. At the bottom of this customized view screen, we see IAP management and IAP site assessment. I want to put a check mark under the columns of on view and default open, and then select the OK button. Now under the band of oxygenation, ventilation, nursing, in INET we see IAP management and IAP assessment populated. The nurse can now document their needs in adjustment to the IABP, and it will stay permanently on the chart. I want to now move over to tasks and how they are associated with INET. You'll notice a considerable amount of tasks that will need to be documented on. Currently, you'll be utilizing the Care Compass to document on task. We've covered Care Compass in lesson number 3 of this video series. Some tasks will have power forms attached to it, and some will direct you now to document in INET. Some tasks will have power forms attached to them. These include, but are not limited to, all education tasks, such as heart failure, stroke, warfarin, and etc., admission histories, and order entry details. Then there are the tasks that direct you to an INET documentation instead of a power form. Tasks that take you to the INET flow sheet include these: the Braden assessment, Morse score, the graph pick score, and vital signs. We'll focus on how to document and complete the task on the ones directed to the INET flow sheet. From the Care Compass on one of our patients, I'm selecting Braden scale assessment. Once it's highlighted, I select document. When documenting from a task, you'll see the task appear under a new band in INET called Activity View. To the right, you see an example of that band, Activity View, and our task of Braden assessments below. You'll see the most current time point of care shows, not the time the task was scheduled for. All yellow boxes are required for completion of the task. If you do not document in all the yellow boxes, the task will not disappear from your patient access list or your Care Compass. What if you need to change the time? What would you do? We discussed this back in lesson number 3. Right-clicking on a time column will change the time, utilize and insert new date and time. But documentation on this will not remove the task at all. To modify the date and time of documentation, you must follow these steps on the next few slides. Here's the Braden task set to the time of 1300, which is that point of care time or the actual time that I selected the task to document on. But I need to change that time to 8 o'clock. To do so, I need to locate the blue cylinder icon and select it. This icon is the Change Task Documentation Time icon. A documentation time pop-up screen appears. Change the date and time to correspond with the actual time the assessment was performed, and place a check mark in the checkbox next to the task you are changing the time for. Then select the OK button. You will see the new time column appear with the 8 o'clock. Also, you will notice the icon with the 2 papers has moved from the 1300 time slot to the 8 a.m. time slot. This icon tells you that the task time has changed, and once saved, the task will disappear. Complete the documentation needed. You'll notice when you go back to Care Compass that the Braden score task is now completed and is removed from the Care Compass task list. Our final segment that I would like to cover on this video session is the intake and output band. Let's spend a few minutes talking about the intake and output band. It is divided into two folders, intake and output, as shown to the right. Each folder has subbands underneath it. Here's a screenshot of the documentation fields and columns that would appear when you selected the intake and output band on an actual patient. Unlike in other areas in INET, where the time columns ran by the actual times, the time columns within intake and output run hourly, as shown highlighted. In addition to the hourly columns, you have some total column fields. These are the 24-hour time columns and the shift columns. Some columns auto-fill in from the medication administrations, such as continuous IV fluids, IV piggybacks, and IV pushes. Just like in other areas of INET, there are some detail rows that are truncated and need to be expanded in order to see the data to document on it. Here you see the medications, oral intake, and blood products detail lines expanded out. The icon that looks like a check mark and a question mark indicates a pulled over volume that needs to be confirmed by the nurse before being calculated into the totals. The user has to right-click on the column and select the confirm item in order to get these to calculate into the totals for intake and output. Under output, some items have number counts versus milliliter volumes. These counts keep track of episodes but do not count in the total output. Finally, at the bottom of the screen, you will see a running balance for hours, shifts, and days. This running balance totals all of the entries in one column. This concludes the Cerner video series on lesson number 7, INO and INET. Stay tuned for the next series, lesson number 8, order entry.